Imagine a weapon so powerful it could bring the world's mightiest empire to its knees, yet it requires no bullets, no bombs, no bloodshed. Now imagine that weapon as a simple spinning wheel operated by an elderly man in a loincloth. Sound impossible? The British Empire thought so too until their textile industry collapsed, their factories shuttered, and their economic stranglehold on India disintegrated. This is the untold story of how Mahatma Gandhi didn't just challenge British rule, he bankrupted it. While history remembers his political resistance, few understand his devastating economic warfare that transformed ordinary cloth into an empire-destroying weapon. Subscribe to discover how one man's financial genius dismantled centuries of colonial exploitation and why Manchester's silent factories today stand as monuments to his victory. Walk through Manchester's rain-soaked streets today and you'll encounter the remnants of a vanished empire. Massive red brick warehouses converted into luxury residences. Ancient canal systems now hosting leisure boats rather than industrial barges. Silent factory chimneys that once blackened the sky with coal smoke from 1,000 fires. These structures are tombstones marking an era when this city functioned as the world's workshop. During the 19th century, Manchester wasn't merely a city, it was an engine. It pulsed as the beating heart of the British Empire. It was where colonial raw materials were transformed into gold that financed the Royal Navy. The city's wealth appeared so limitless it seemed eternal. The textile magnates of Lancashire believed they'd engineered a perpetual money machine. They extracted cotton from Indian fields, transported it halfway across the globe, spun it into cloth using steam-powered mills, then sold it back to the very people who'd cultivated it at massive profit. It was a flawless circle of exploitation. It was the economic engine enabling a small North Atlantic island to dominate a quarter of humanity. They believed nothing could halt this machine. They possessed the guns, they controlled the ships, they commanded the capital. But they overlooked one critical element. They failed to recognize that their entire wealth empire depended on the cooperation of millions they were exploiting. They couldn't foresee that one man in a simple loincloth could reach into the complex machinery of this global system and simply extract the essential pin. This is how Mahatma Gandhi didn't merely fight the British Empire politically. He fought them financially. He understood the British weren't in India to spread civilization. They were there for profit, and he determined to render them insolvent. To comprehend his strategy, we must return to the beginning. We must understand the crime before grasping the punishment. We must examine what India represented before British arrival and how the decimation of its economy enabled Manchester's rise. In the early 18th century, India wasn't an impoverished nation. It was the world's industrial powerhouse. It controlled 25% of the global economy, and the jewel in its economic crown was textiles. Bengal's weavers were legendary. They produced cotton fabric so exquisite it was known throughout Europe as woven air. They created muslin so delicate an entire dress could pass through a wedding ring. The courts of Versailles and London obsessed over Indian cloth. It represented the highest quality and most comfortable fabric money could purchase. British merchants who first arrived in India came as humble traders. They came to purchase. They stood awestruck before Indian looms and the artisans who'd perfected their craft across millennia. But as the East India Company transitioned from trading enterprise to military conqueror, dynamics shifted. They realized they didn't want to compete with Indian weavers. They wanted to replace them. The Industrial Revolution was commencing in England. Inventors like Richard Arkwright and James Hargreaves were constructing machines capable of spinning cotton faster than any human hand. Yet these machines produced coarse, rough cloth that couldn't compete with high-quality Indian handcrafted textiles. In a free market, British mills would have bankrupted trying to compete with India. So the British decided to manipulate the market. They wielded their political power to annihilate their competition. The destruction of India's textile industry ranks among economic history's most brutal chapters. It wasn't natural decline, it was systematic murder. The British imposed massive tariffs on Indian cloth entering England, making it impossible for Indian weavers to sell goods in Europe. Simultaneously, they forced India to open borders to British cloth with zero tariffs. But they went beyond mere taxation. Historical accounts describe a reign of terror against Bengal's weavers. East India Company agents would force weavers to sign contracts selling goods at a loss. If weavers refused, they faced beatings or imprisonment. Dark stories haunt this era's history books. Stories of British agents severing the thumbs of master weavers so they could never transfer skills to their children. Whether these accounts are literally true in every instance or symbolic of the violence, the result was identical. Knowledge was killed. Looms were destroyed. The great weaving centers of Dhaka and Murshidabad, which had been thriving commercial cities for centuries, were reduced to ghost towns. British Governor General William Bentinck famously wrote in 1834 that the bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. It was a grim acknowledgement of what had been perpetrated. The artisans who had clothed the world were forced to return to the land as landless peasants. They starved because their livelihood had been stolen to clear paths for Manchester's factories. By the mid-19th century, the transformation was complete. India had been reduced from manufacturer to raw material supplier. Indian farmers were forced to cultivate cotton. They picked cotton under scorching sun and sold it for pennies to British agents. That cotton was packed onto British ships and sent to Liverpool. It was transported by train to Manchester. It was spun into cloth by British workers whose wages fueled the British economy. Then that finished cloth was shipped back to India. And here's the cruelest part of the trap: Indian people were forced to purchase this British cloth because their own industry had been destroyed. They had no alternative. They were wearing the very cotton they'd grown, but paying the British for the privilege. This was the wealth drain, a massive siphon that sucked capital out of India and poured it into London's banks. It funded Victorian mansions. It funded railways. It funded empire expansion into Africa and Asia. The British elite believed the system would last forever. They called it free trade, but it was really a monopoly enforced by gunboats. When Mahatma Gandhi returned to India in 1915 after his years in South Africa, he observed his country with fresh perspective. He saw the poverty, he saw the despair. But unlike many other nationalists of his time, Gandhi didn't just see political oppression. He saw the economic equation. He realized the British Raj wasn't a government in the traditional sense. It was a commercial enterprise. The British were a nation of shopkeepers, as Napoleon had called them. They were in India because it was profitable to be in India. Gandhi realized that as long as India remained profitable, the British would never leave voluntarily. You could eliminate a few soldiers and they'd send more. You could riot in streets and they'd arrest you. But if you eliminated the profit, if you made the ledger bleed red ink, they'd leave of their own accord. He understood that the pillar of their power was textile trade. It was Britain's single largest export. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers in Lancashire. It was the industry that had built the modern British state, and Gandhi recognized that this strength was also their greatest vulnerability. The entire industry relied on Indian consumers. If Indian people simply refused to purchase the cloth, Manchester's factories would stop. The money would stop. The empire would become a burden instead of an asset. This was a revolutionary idea. Most revolutionaries think in terms of seizing power. Gandhi thought in terms of seizing the supply chain. He began preaching a philosophy that initially confused many people. He didn't discuss guns or bombs. He discussed spinning wheels. He initiated the khadi movement. Khadi is hand-spun, hand-woven cloth. It's rough. It's simple. It's not as comfortable or smooth as machine-made industrial cloth from England. But Gandhi told India's people that khadi was sacred. He told them every yard of British cloth they purchased was a chain binding them to slavery. He told them every time they wore a Manchester shirt, they were stealing food from a starving Indian weaver's mouth. He transformed the act of dressing yourself into a political act of war. Gandhi was a branding genius. He knew he had to lead by example. He removed his Western suits, the clothes of a lawyer and gentleman. He put on a simple loincloth made of khadi. He sat down publicly with a charkha, a traditional spinning wheel, and he began to spin. He spun for hours daily. He spun while conversing with diplomats. He spun while delivering speeches. He made the spinning wheel the revolution's symbol. He told the Indian elite, the lawyers and doctors and wealthy merchants, that they had to burn their foreign clothes. He organized massive bonfires in cities like Bombay and Kolkata. Imagine the scene: thousands of people gathering in public squares carrying their finest suits, silk shirts, expensive dresses made in Lancashire's mills. They threw them onto a pile, and as flames rose, destroying millions of rupees worth of property, the crowd cheered. It was ritual purification. They were burning their dependence. They were burning the psychological hold the British had over them. The British laughed initially. Winston Churchill famously called Gandhi a half-naked fakir. British officials in Delhi drank gin and tonics and joked about the little man with his spinning wheel. They said, "You cannot stop the modern world with medieval technology." They said, "You cannot fight the Industrial Revolution with a piece of wood." They didn't understand what Gandhi was doing. He wasn't trying to compete with Manchester in terms of efficiency. He was trying to destroy Manchester's market share. He was building a wall of moral refusal. He made it shameful to wear foreign cloth. If you walked down the street in a British suit, people would look at you with disgust. You were a collaborator. You were a traitor. The social pressure was immense. And then the numbers started shifting. Orders from India began drying up. Ships arriving in Bombay and Kolkata weren't emptying cargo holds as quickly as before. Manchester's warehouses began filling with unsold stock. Lancashire's mill owners started getting nervous. They'd always assumed the Indian market was bottomless, that expanded factories and hired thousands of workers based on the assumption that 300 million Indians would always need British clothes. But now the Indians were making their own. It was rough cloth. It was itchy. But they wore it with pride. The khadi movement was spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just about clothes anymore. It was about dignity. Gandhi had given the poorest peasant a weapon. You didn't need a gun to fight the British. You just needed to spin. You just needed to say no. The economic impact was slow initially, but it accelerated. By the 1920s, textile exports from Britain to India were dropping significantly. The Great Depression hit in 1929, which worsened things, but the boycott was the hammer blow. The Indian National Congress formally adopted the boycott of foreign goods as its primary strategy. They picketed shops that sold British cloth. Women played a huge role in this. They would stand outside textile shops and plead with customers not to buy. They would lie down in doorways so you'd have to step over their bodies to purchase a British shirt. It was effective. Shopkeepers stopped stocking British goods because they couldn't sell them. Import figures collapsed. In some years, imports of British cloth fell by more than 50%. This was catastrophic for Lancashire. In northern England's industrial towns, the lights started going out. Mills that had run 24 hours daily suddenly cut their shifts. Then they went to 3 days weekly. Then they closed gates entirely. The chimneys stopped smoking. Silence fell over the towns of Blackburn and Darwin and Burnley. Tens of thousands of British workers were thrown out of their jobs. These were hard men and women. They'd worked in mills all their lives. Their fathers and grandfathers had worked in mills. They didn't understand India's politics. They only knew the orders had stopped. They only knew there was no money for food. The poverty in Lancashire in the 1930s was terrible. Families were living on scraps. Men were standing on street corners begging for work. The British press blamed Gandhi. They called him the villain who was starving British workers. They tried to turn England's working class against the Indian independence movement. But Gandhi was playing a long game. He knew that by inflicting pain on the British working class, he was creating a political crisis in London. Politicians could ignore a riot in Delhi, but they couldn't ignore mass unemployment in Manchester. Voters in England were angry. Pressure on the government to solve the India problem was growing. Gandhi was forcing the British to do a cost-benefit analysis. Was holding on to India worth the destruction of their own domestic industry? Was the jewel in the crown worth the price if it was bankrupting the homeland? This brings us to one of the most surreal and powerful moments in 20th century history. In 1931, Gandhi was invited to London for the Round Table Conference to discuss India's future. He was the enemy of the state. He was the man who was destroying the British economy. But he did something no ordinary politician would do. He asked to visit Lancashire. He wanted to go to the heart of the devastation he'd caused. He wanted to look the unemployed workers in the eye. The British government was terrified. They thought he'd be lynched. They thought angry mobs of unemployed mill workers would attack him. Why would they welcome the man who'd taken their jobs? But Gandhi insisted. He traveled up north to the grim industrial towns. He stayed in simple houses. He walked through streets wrapped in his white shawl against the cold English rain. And then a miracle happened. The workers didn't attack him. They came out in their thousands to see him. They cheered him. These men and women who'd lost everything, who were hungry and desperate, looked at this small, frail man, and they saw something that London's politicians didn't see. They saw a man of truth. They saw a man fighting for his people just as they were fighting for theirs. There's a famous photograph of Gandhi standing surrounded by female mill workers of Darwin. They're all smiling. One woman is holding his arm. It's a picture of incredible humanity. Gandhi spoke to them. He explained his position. He told them, I am not against you. I'm against the system that exploits both of us. He told them about poverty in India. He told them about the skeletons he'd seen in villages. He said to them, I am pained by your poverty, but in India, we have no food at all. He famously told a group of workers, my dear, you have no idea what poverty is. He explained that the average Indian earned in a year what the average British worker earned in a week, even on the dole. He asked them to understand that he couldn't let his people starve just to keep Manchester's mills running. The workers listened. One union leader famously said to him, Mr. Gandhi, I understand we are suffering, but you are suffering more. It was a moment of solidarity that shattered British propaganda. The government wanted the workers to hate Gandhi, but the workers respected him. This visit was a masterstroke. It humanized the Indian struggle for the British public. It showed that Gandhi wasn't a monster, but a man of immense moral courage. But it didn't stop the boycott. Gandhi left Lancashire with their blessings, but he didn't promise to buy their cloth. He went back to India and tightened the screws. The mills stayed closed. Grass grew in the cracks of factory floors. The British Empire was bleeding money. The textile trade never recovered. Gandhi had proven that you didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy to win a war. You just needed to understand where the money came from, and then turn off the tap. The fires of the foreign cloth bonfires were still smoldering in Bombay's streets when Gandhi decided to open a second front in his economic war. He'd already attacked the textile industry, the biggest earner for the British Empire. Now he turned his eyes to something even more fundamental, something every human being needed to survive: salt. To the average observer, salt seems like a small thing. It's a condiment. It's cheap. It's everywhere. But Gandhi looked at salt and saw the perfect symbol of colonial tyranny. The British Raj had a monopoly on salt production and sale in India.